Hello. This program has been an interesting challenge for me, and I think you'll understand why as I develop it for you. First of all, many thanks to Amanda Taylor, the director of the Concordia Parish Public Library, and her team, and Delta Bank for sponsoring this, making these possible for all of you, and giving me a great opportunity to learn things about people and things I wouldn't have known before. Right now, Vladimir Putin is creating a lot of noise on the world stage. He dominates the news for all the wrong reasons as far as the Western world is concerned. His aggression in Ukraine is ongoing, much, I think, to his surprise, because the Ukrainians have been able to mount a fight that has put him back on his heels in several different ways. Putin himself, though, is a shadow figure. He's an enigma. He's somebody we don't really know. He has been a prominent world leader for 22 years. And yet, what we know about Putin, the man, is dictated 100% by what Putin, the man, chooses us to know about him. He's very passionate about many things, but nothing more than the USSR. That was the country that he was born into, and that was the country he saw dissolve into various republics. And his primary role in life now is to reunite the USSR and make it his own. He's a control freak. There's really no other way to describe him. He controls his media, he controls his image, he controls everything that happens in Russia and in the countries that he has taken over since he's become the president of Russia. He makes a great appearance, frankly. If you just look at him, when he's on the job, he's always in a well-tailored suit, an expensive suit. He's known and teased about the fact that he always has very handsome, very expensive wristwatches. It's interesting, when he was in the first grade, he was the only child in his entire elementary school that had a wristwatch. So for Putin, it has always been a symbol of personal importance and personal status. He's also memorable when he's in a more relaxed venue. This picture of him astride a horse with no shirt on has become sort of a worldwide meme, as it were. People think of Putin and they start thinking about this and they start making fun of it. He very carefully does control his image, though. These shirtless photos are on purpose. He always, and you can track it with his history, he always appears on a horse without a shirt on when it's important for him to remind his people and the rest of the world that he's very powerful, he's very masculine, he's very healthy. He plans these photo ops. He goes shirtless when he's riding a very small horse. He's only 5'7". He's very broad-chested. So without a shirt on and riding a small horse, he appears to be a much bigger man than he really is. In July of 2022, the G7 met, of course, without him. And the other world leaders, I believe led by the ex-Prime Minister Boris Johnson, made fun of Putin's habit of going shirtless. And a couple of them, led by Johnson, suggested that maybe they should be photographed for their portrait that time without their shirts on. Of course, the Associated Press reporters couldn't wait to ask Putin about that. And this was his reply. I don't know how they wanted to get undressed above or below the waist, but I think it would be a disgusting sight in any case. Putin is essentially unknown to his own public. But when he was suddenly thrust on the leadership stage to become the president of Russia, he found a very clever way to introduce himself to his people. He simply wrote a book about himself. Here it is. It's called First Person, an astonishingly frank self-portrait by Russia's president, Vladimir Putin. It's an interesting book. I recommend it to you. It's actually a series of interviews with selected journalists in Russia. A total of, I think, 24 hours that he spent with them. And it was published in May of 2000, so it's coming out, it's being discussed as he's becoming the president. He gave 6 interviews to 3 Russian journalists, and he took 100% control of what was written. The result is a book that's mostly written in the question and answer format, which is a very easy one to read, as you know. It's interspersed periodically with interviews with others, like a grade school teacher, his former wife. And in it, he discusses his childhood, his beloved career as a Russian spy for the KGB, and his rise to become president of Russia. His answers are both intriguing, some banal. He confesses that he loves beer, for example. I could have done without that. I want to know something about what makes the man tick. But everything that he says helps to put him in focus, but only in focus of the picture that he wants to be seen. The book was published in Russia between the time Boris Yeltsin resigned, who was the president of Russia before Putin, and the presidential elections. The book that I recommend to you all, if you're interested in knowing more about Putin, more about the man, is this one. It's called The Man Without a Face, The Unlikely Rise of Vladimir Putin. What makes it such an excellent book is that the writer is a journalist who worked in Russia, who knew Putin, who actually defied Putin on more than one occasion. Her name is Masha Gessen. The book itself was published in 2012. 12 years after Putin's book was published, The Man Without a Face, The Unlikely Rise of Vladimir Putin was published. So you have his signed, sealed, and delivered image of himself in one book, and 12 years later, Gessen dares to write an expose of the real Putin. She's an American journalist. She lived and worked in Russia, and this book, I would have to say, is a very fair-minded book. It's a very balanced book where he deserves credit for good things, and there are some. She gives him credit. But where he deserves to be called on the carpet for lies and misrepresentations, she does that too. It's written from a journalist's point of view, so it's very factual. But she also is an excellent writer, and so it's not dry facts. It's facts encased in a narrative that's very, very interesting and it does not perpetuate Putin's propaganda. Who is she? Who's this woman who decided that she would dare him and that she would write such a book? She was born in 1967. She's Russian-American. She won a Guggenheim Fellowship and a Carnegie Fellowship, both very prestigious fellowships to have. She lived in Moscow for a number of years. And in 1981, she immigrated to America, but then later she returned to Russia as a journalist because she thought fair-minded journalists should have an opportunity to tell the story. She's written 2 books. The one, Man Without a Face, you know. The other, Dead Again, the Russian intelligentsia after communism in 1997. She was named editor-in-chief of a very popular science journal in Russia, but because she crossed Putin, she was fired in 2012. She refused to cover one of his events. She was a very well-known journalist and was very much respected, and he expected her to be there and she wouldn't go. And she told him she was not go because it was merely propaganda, and she was a journalist and wasn't interested in doing propaganda. In 2013, the year after she was fired by him, she returned to the US, and she had a number of very good writing posts as a journalist. She wrote for the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, Vanity Fair, the New Yorker, and Slate. In an interview on PBS Frontline, she said this about Putin, which may be the most, I think, relevant statement she said about him ever. She said, quote, "He has wanted to be a secret agent all of his life, as long as he can remember." The only way to really understand Vladimir Putin and understand his motivations is to take a quick look at Russian history, particularly modern Russian history. There were 3 significant events that each has challenged him, and each has made a difference in the way he perceives his country, his homeland. First, in 1917, the Russian Revolution, then the formation of the USSR, and then the collapse of the Soviet Union. Russia is huge. You can see from the map here, it and then the little satellite countries around it. It's really quite an impressive land mass. No wonder he wants it all back under his control. It would give him much more power in terms of world affairs. I want you to look with me at the leaders of Soviet Russia, the USSR. It starts in 1917 and it's going to end in 1991. Here's a list of them, and you'll notice that I have 4 of them highlighted. That's because those are the 4 whose presidencies or leadership made the biggest difference, not only on the USSR, but also on Putin's understanding of what the USSR had been and could be once again. First, 1917 to 1924, we have Lenin, Vladimir Lenin. Make a note of this mentally. Putin has said that the finest leader ever of the Soviet Union was Lenin. He's his idol. Then 41 to 43, Joseph Stalin. Most of us are familiar with Stalin because of our study of the World War history. 58 to 64, Nikita Khrushchev. Name even more familiar to many of you. And then 1985 to 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev. In 1917, the Russian Revolution really caused a seismic change all around the world. The shock was felt everywhere. The Bolsheviks overthrew the Russian Tsar. And what this did was it was supposed to mean that now the people would be governed by the people. There were 4 socialist republics established, and the Marxist revolutionary Vladimir Lenin became the leader, and he served until 1924. And again, Putin idolized him. In 1922, during Lenin's reign, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, or the USSR, was formed. Russia joined the other republics, and gradually others came in as well. Most important to remember about this is that the USSR is ruled 100% by the Communist Party, and they have no intention of losing that authority. It became the world's largest country with a surface area of approximately 22 million miles. At one time, it ranked 3rd in the world in population with nearly 300 million people. And when the USSR collapsed, both the landmass and the population were greatly reduced. This is the Russia that Putin has. The USSR is the Russia that Putin wants. Stalin, 41 to 53, he completed the process of making the USSR a totally totalitarian state so that the government controlled every aspect of life. It controlled the economy, it controlled the industrial activity. He established collective farms, where everybody would work the same and be the same, and then they would share everything the same. And anybody who opposed Stalin got arrested, and they were either executed or they were sent to something called a gulag, which were the labor camps, usually in Siberia, where it was unbelievably cold. In 2009, in a Reuters article entitled, "Putin Calls for Balanced Assessment of Stalin," this is what the writer said, quote, "Russians like Stalin for turning an illiterate peasant nation into an industrialized nuclear superpower and for crushing Nazism." And in a lot of ways, that's true, but there were a lot of bad things about Stalin as well. 58 to 64, Nikita Khrushchev comes on the scene. Now, he's serving at the height of the Cold War. And at the very beginning of his term, he was very pro-Stalin. He thought that Stalin was the man. But as he moved through in his tenure as the leader, he began seeing Stalin's weaknesses, the things that weren't working for the Russian people. And so ultimately he disavowed Stalin. He tried to reform the Soviet Union in his own way. He did away many things that were making the Soviet people's lives repressive, and he called himself a reformer. We, however, in the West, and particularly in America, remember Khrushchev for initiating the Cuban Missile Crisis. Khrushchev was essentially a barely educated man. He was a ruffian, and he didn't have the perception that comes with education and experience to really evaluate properly how his actions would be perceived. In other words, Khrushchev was not a chess player or a checkers player. He could make one move, but he had no clue what the other moves might be following that, and it created problems for him. The tenure of Mikhail Gorbachev from 85 to 91 is the one that should be most familiar to most of you. He began his career as a very successful Communist Party member. He moved right on up as a politician supported by the Communist Party. And remember, the Communist Party is the only party anyway. He introduced political openness to the Russian people. The word is glasnost. And in that process, he did some very remarkable things very quickly. He eliminated book banning, for example. He also eliminated the secret police, unheard of. He released political dissidents, political prisoners, let them out of the gulags. And he allowed the press to print criticisms of the government. But the thing he did that caused the most trouble for him in many eyes was he allowed parties other than the Communist Party to participate in elections. This is a cartoon I found I thought you'd like. Obviously, the military-industrial complex of Russia didn't think glasnost was good at all. And so here you have Gorbachev saying glasnost, and then you have the general with all of his medals saying Gesundheit. That's about what they thought of it. He also introduced economic restructuring. He called this one perestroika. Perestroika was the part of Gorbachev's plan that frightened and threatened Putin more than any of the rest of it. In it, Gorbachev allowed individuals and cooperatives to actually privately own businesses. Unheard of. Gone are the collective farms. Now you can have your own, and you can operate it, and you're in charge of it, and you get whatever you make from it. Workers were allowed to go on strike for better wages and conditions. Are you kidding me? Stalin would have killed them or put them to the gulags. Foreign entities were encouraged to invest in Soviet businesses. So you're bringing the West into Soviet Russia. This is another cartoon I found. I think it's kind of cute. It really says more than it may appear. In this one, you'll notice it's a little later cartoon, and you'll notice that Gorbachev is not portrayed as handsomely as he was in the previous one. He has his signature birthmark that runs across the top of his head. It shows here. And he appears to be trying to do some sort of repairs to this automobile, which is called the USSR. 1988, Time magazine names Gorbachev Man of the Year for ending the Cold War. 1989, the next year, Time names Gorbachev its Man of the Decade for ending the Cold War. And then the next year, 1990, Gorbachev wins the Nobel Peace Prize. He was on quite a run. But in 1991, just 1 year later, everything crashes. Gorbachev is placed under house arrest, and leaders of a coup declare a state of emergency. What that means is that the Communist Party had had enough. They weren't interested in democracy. They weren't interested in becoming part of the world like the West is. They were through. They wanted to go back and have their own little fiefdoms again. They wanted to return to the time when they had absolute control and the people were under their thumbs. Military moved on Moscow. Boris Yeltsin was chairman of the parliament at the time, and it was a case of he was just at the right place at the right time to take a stand against the coup. He wanted the people to still be safe, and he didn't want a military authority to suppress them. So he rallied the crowds, and he helped them put away the coup. The republics, though, had gotten a taste of what freedom could look like under Gorbachev. And so different ones of them began pulling away and becoming independent states from the USSR. And they actually formed what they called a Commonwealth of independent states. Christmas Day of 1991, Gorbachev resigned. And at that point, Russia became an independent country. The USSR didn't exist anymore. According to History.com, listen to this. Perestroika had torpedoed the command economy that had kept the Soviet state afloat, but the market economy took time to mature. In his farewell address, Gorbachev summed up the problem. He said, quote, "The old system collapsed before the new one had time to begin working." We're now living in a new world. An end has been put to the Cold War and to the arms race, as well as to the mad militarization of the country, which has crippled our economy, public attitudes, and our morals. Gorbachev became a figure on the world stage in a way that the others before him had not, and frankly, in a way that Putin has not. He moved easily with the leaders of the West. He and Ronald Reagan, of course, executed the end of the Cold War with their treaties, and he became personal friends with Reagan. And he and his wife, Raisa, went to California to the ranch to visit the Reagans, and they truly developed a good friendship, a strong enough friendship that when Reagan's funeral was held, Gorbachev was one of the invited guests. This picture shows he with former British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher and former Canadian Prime Minister Mulroney at Reagan's funeral. Gorbachev died in August 2022, and it put Putin in a very difficult position. Because Gorbachev was a world figure and his death became worldwide news, Putin couldn't just ignore him, which, trust me, would have been his preference. Instead, he did several things to try to preserve his image, but also to show a kind of respect for Gorbachev. He went to the hospital where Gorbachev's remains were, and he left flowers, and he made sure that he was pictured in his nice black suit with the black tie, showing respect to Gorbachev. But then, coming out of the USSR was the journalist's account of what was actually going to happen. The name with Gorbachev and the funeral plans and all that. The two CNN Russia reporters filed a report titled, "Putin Snubs Funeral of Former Soviet Leader Mikhail Gorbachev." And it reads this way: Vladimir Putin will not attend the funeral of Mikhail Gorbachev, the Kremlin said Thursday, in a snub of the former Soviet leader with whom the Russian president had a fraught relationship. Very carefully selected word, fraught. Putin couldn't stand him. Spokesman Dmitry Peskov said, Putin's work schedule will not allow him to take part in the farewell ceremony for Gorbachev on September 3rd, adding that the Russian president visited the Central Clinical Hospital today to pay his respects to Gorbachev, laying flowers by the coffin. A farewell ceremony for Gorbachev, which will be open to the public, is due to take place on Saturday, followed by the funeral later on the same day in Moscow's most famous, important cemetery. It is unclear whether Gorbachev, who is credited for helping to end the Cold War, will be honored with a state funeral. In a stark contrast to the Kremlin's actions following the death of the former president Boris Yeltsin in 2007, the Russian government did not announce any plans for a state funeral when it released a statement on Gorbachev's death on Wednesday. Gorbachev will be buried next to his wife, Raisa, who died in 1999, Russian state media Novosti said earlier this week, citing the Gorbachev Foundation. The historical cemetery is the final resting place of many notable Russians, including writers like Anton Chekhov. Former leaders Yeltsin and Khrushchev are also buried there. The writers end their article with this very tactful paragraph. Gorbachev grew more critical of Putin and his increasingly restrictive regime in recent years as he traveled the world promoting free speech and democracy as a part of his foundation. Meanwhile, Putin blamed Gorbachev for the demise of the USSR, which he considers to be the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. I'm now going to take you back in time to when Putin was born. And I'm going to move you through to today with his life. And I'm going to do that with very, very sketchy and often contradictory resource materials. His childhood is even shrouded in mystery. This is a picture of him. I love it. It's Putin with his mama. He's sitting on her lap. He was a very treasured child, apparently. I think he was, in the modern vernacular, he was a spoiled brat. He did have two older brothers, and they had died. One brother during the siege of Leningrad, and one died later as an infant, probably of disease. This picture of him, he looks a little pouty. The personality, I think, is beginning to show. He was born on October 7th, 1952, in Leningrad, the Soviet Union. And later, Leningrad was renamed St. Petersburg, Russia. He was the youngest, and Stalin was in power. His father, Vladimir Putin, was born in 1911, died in 1999. His mother, Maria, was born in 1911 and died in 1998. His grandfather, Spiridon Putin, worked as a personal cook for both Lenin and Stalin, so his family has some political connection. He describes himself as a street kid. In fact, the word he uses most often to describe his childhood is that he was a hoodlum. He's very proud of that. He grew up in a city that had suffered through a 3-year Nazi siege in World War II. And it was a horrible place, Leningrad, during that siege. People starved, disease was rampant, it was horrible. His father suffered a major injury from shrapnel during World War II, and his mother nearly starved to death during that same period. When Putin was just 6 years old, Khrushchev comes to power. This is a picture of his mother and his father and himself. He's now obviously a young man. I think one of the most interesting things that Georgiann brings out in her book is the belief by many Russians that Putin was adopted, that he was not their natural child, that they could not possibly have had a child, but there he was. And what Georgiann points out that's particularly interesting is that prior to his being about 6 years old, there's virtually no record of a Vladimir Putin, nothing. So she finally reaches the conclusion that the rumors are rampant, but the proof is absent. Leningrad lost most of its population during the siege, so it's left a devastated city in poverty. After the war, the Putins lived in an apartment with 2 other families, one of them Jewish. The apartment had rats, it had no hot water, it had no bathtub, it had almost no heat, it had a broken toilet, and a community kitchen, which was the basis for many disagreements. Putin said that he and his friends basically chased rats around with sticks. That was one of their toys. That's what they did for fun. His daddy worked in a factory, and his mother did any odd job she could find, including sweeping streets and washing test tubes in one of the labs. And so Putin, as a child, was left alone a great deal of the time, and because of his small size, he was bullied badly by other children. Putin, however, remembers his mother and his father with honor, but especially his mother with love. He said this at one point: "We lived simply. Cabbage soup, cutlets, pancakes, but on Sundays and holidays, my mom would bake very delicious stuffed buns with cabbage meat and rice." These were the Russian interpretation of the pierogi. And they had curd tarts, particularly lemon, which he absolutely loved. He was a very frustrated child, young man, early teens, the small stature, the bullying from the others. He said that he learned that if there were going to be a fight, he'd better throw the first punch. And it should be a nasty one to try to settle everything down rather quickly. He discovered judo and the martial arts, and he began taking out his frustration and his anger through that controlled sports venue, and he became very good about it. He's actually written 2 or 3 books about judo and published them. He hung around a communal courtyard that was kind of next to the public building where their apartment was. And there were a lot of drunks hanging out there. There was a lot of fighting, a lot of cursing. His vocabulary increased exponentially. And of course, the idea always bullied the littler kids. He was very indifferent at school, didn't really care for school. But the martial arts and the judo gave him a kind of personal discipline that frankly he had not had before. His mother was furious that he was doing the fighting. She didn't want her boy to be involved in that. He even talks at times about having joined a street gang and how important that was to his maturation, because he learned the value of teamwork. He learned the importance of being with others who would protect him if he needed to be protected. This is a picture of him in his probably 14th year. And again, the eyes are telling to me that this is going to be a strong man and he's going to have his own way. Putin, at age 15, I think, went to see a movie. This is the poster of the movie. The movie was entitled The Sword and the Shield. It came out in 1968, and he has always insisted that his career was mightily inspired by that film. It was about a Soviet double agent, a master spy in Nazi Germany. When he saw the film, he knew for the first time what his life was destined for. He was going to be a KGB agent. He was going to be a spy. In the 9th grade, at age 15, with this movie under his belt, he marched into the local KGB office and volunteered to become a spy. They told him that he would need to get an education first, and they suggested a law degree would be preferred, and then to come back and they would talk to him. That's when his academic interest was set fire. Khrushchev left office when Putin was 13, but he was very well of what Khrushchev had done, and he was impressed by Khrushchev's invasion, the Cuban business. He liked that show of Russian power against the West. Now he knows his goal. He must get a law degree so he could become a KGB agent. He focused on his studies. He learned German, and he's fluent in that language. I don't think he has any other language but German. I couldn't find any evidence of it, other than, of course, his mother tongue of Russian. In 1975, he graduated Leningrad State University with a degree in law. And in that same year, 75, he finally realized his dream. He joined the KGB's Foreign Intelligence Service and began extensive training. He served for 15 years, and he had appointments all over Russia, which would serve him well. And it frustrated him because he wanted to go to a foreign country and be a spy and do intelligence work and make the big bucks. And instead, he was roaming around Russia itself. He was still spying, of course. They were spying on their own people. But he wasn't getting out, and he wasn't making the kind of money that the intelligence people could make if they were stationed in a foreign country. Along the way, though, 2 things happened. One, he learned his country. in a way that he would not have learned it any other way. Russia's big, even just Russia, not the USSR. So he learned the people, he learned their cultures, he became familiar with Russia. And he also found a bride. He fell in love. 1983, he married a specialist in foreign languages and a former flight attendant. They were married almost 30 years and then divorced after. They had 2 daughters, but in 2014, they dissolved the marriage. According to any reports that you can find, it was a mutual decision. She has not spoken against him since the divorce, during the divorce, or before the divorce, nor has he spoken against her. This is a picture of him in his KGB uniform. He's a very proud man. Look at the eyes again. I mean, this fellow is determined. In 1985, 2 years after Putin is married, Mikhail Gorbachev becomes the leader of the USSR. From 85 to 90, Putin gets his assignment out of Russia. He's assigned to East Germany, and he's going to work for the KGB there. There, he and his wife experienced, quote, the good life, close quote, in the German Democratic Republic. They saw something outside of Russia for the very first time. Putin saw it for the first time. They loved it because they had luxuries that they couldn't get in the Russia itself. In Dresden, the KGB office was in the same building as the East German secret police were located, and Putin was assigned liaison duty between the secret police of the East Germans and the Russian KGB. The story about him is that he was so taken with Western goods, with things, luxuries that were unimaginable in Russia, that he became obsessed with Western mail order catalogs. And he read those to keep up with what the latest fashion was and what the latest trends were. He loved his beer. He had a weekly supply reserved for himself and delivered, and he got pretty pudgy. And he saved money, he and his wife. They didn't buy anything for their apartment. They saved money for things that they might take back to Russia when he returned. And they hoped they'd have enough money to buy the ultimate luxury, a car. This is a picture of the building where the KGB and the East German secret police had joint offices. They were separate, but they were in the same building. 1989, the world changed. The Berlin Wall fell. Suddenly, the secret police and the KGB knew that things were not going to be the same, and so they started destroying every bit of evidence of the intelligence that they had accumulated in the years that they had worked there. And the Putins returned to Leningrad. From 1991 till today, there is no USSR. There is only Russia. And from the year 2000 until today, 22 years, Vladimir Putin has had 100% control of Russia. There's a small little 4-year period you can see in your chart when Medvedev was the president. At that same time, Putin was conveniently the prime minister, and he ran the country. The other fellow was just a figurehead. So, it's his. After Yeltsin, there comes Putin, whose hand selected by Yeltsin to be his successor. They were very close. Yeltsin has gotten some interesting press, and we'll get into that in just a second. From 1990 to 1996, Putin was either in Leningrad was in Leningrad / St. Petersburg because the name of the city had changed. He worked at the state university. In 91, he makes an unexpected move at the time, and that is he resigns the KGB. And Yeltsin, at the same time, becomes the president of Russia. He's the first president of Russia. There's no USSR anymore, so he's the first one. And he names Putin to a series of positions. He works in the mayor's office in St. Petersburg. He works for government officials. He chairs the Committee for External Relations. He becomes a big person in a relatively small pond. He's in St. Petersburg, but he's growing his resume as he's getting ever increasing responsibilities within Yeltsin's government. Here are 3 quotes from different folks, journalists all, about this time. Bowlby for BBC News in Dresden reported, he, Putin, arrived back to a country that had been transformed under Gorbachev and was itself on the verge of collapse. Then Geeson, our writer of The Man Without a Face, wrote, he, Putin, found himself in a country that had changed in ways that he didn't understand and he didn't want to accept. And then finally, Bowlby again in BBC News in Dresden wrote, in Dresden, he'd been part of a network of individuals who might have lost their Soviet roles, but were well placed to prosper personally and politically in the new Russia. And you can count Vladimir Putin among those. From 96 to the present, we call those the Moscow years. In 96, he was transferred to Moscow, and now he's working as Yeltsin's first deputy manager. The next year, he becomes his deputy chief of staff. The next year, he becomes the presidential first deputy chief of staff in charge of all the Russian regions. And then from 98 to 99, he's director of the Federal Security Service. Guess what that is? That's the KGB under a new name. He also served as the Russian Security Council secretary. So Yeltsin has put him in the best possible track to succeed him as the president. The Federal Security Services, the new swanky modern version of the KGB, had this badge, and it's one that Putin still loves. Putin's power grew from 99 to today. August of 99, Yeltsin names him his prime minister. And just a few months later, in December, on New Year's Eve, Yeltsin resigns and names Putin as his acting president. And in March of 2000, Putin is elected president of Russia. He's the first democratically elected president. He gets, I believe it's 52% of the vote, enough so there doesn't have to be a runoff. But you may be sure he never had so few votes in the future. He fixed that. At the inauguration, Yeltsin stood by him and praised Putin. I said earlier that Yeltsin had been kind of the victim of some interesting press. He got the reputation of being a drunk. He would be dizzy. He would be unsure on his feet. He would be slurring speech. And the Russian people and the journalists just figured he was a drunk. And so they were really glad to see Yeltsin go. The truth was Yeltsin had some very serious health problems. He had heart surgery during all of this. He had to take medications. So when he would miss a state dinner, for example, because he didn't feel well, it wasn't because he was hungover or drunk as a skunk. It was because he was really unhealthy. A Russian journalist put it this way in that Frontline interview on PBS. He said, a guy, and he's speaking now of Putin, a guy who just appeared from nowhere and became a prime minister. For most of the Russians, he was a guy from nowhere. Of course, Russian journalists knew that he was the head of the Federal Security Service, aka KGB, and that before that he used to work in St. Petersburg for the mayor. But for the majority of the Russian people, he was just a guy who came from nowhere and who showed himself being strong and being a real leader. And maybe that's why everyone loved him at the beginning. Putin wasted no time in establishing absolute control. Susan Glaser, in foreignpolicy.com, wrote a piece called Little to Celebrate in Putin's Russia. This is what she wrote. 20 years ago, if you had asked me, or basically anyone, whether Vladimir Putin would soon become the longest-serving Russian leader since Joseph Stalin, the response would have likely been either incredulous silence or uproarious laughter. When he ascended to the Russian presidency while still in his 40s, Putin's main qualifications for the job, at least based on the many Russians I spoke with during his first years in office when I was the Washington Post co-bureau chief in Moscow, were that he was young, articulate, and literally sober. So Yeltsin's reputation as being a drunk helped Putin become perhaps more than he was in those early years. He was left looking at the old USSR map and seeing what was, and he began plotting methodically how to put it all back together again. What's he done since he took power? Some things you know and some things you might not even expect that he would have done. First of all, you would expect, and he did, absolutely consolidate power with himself. He very carefully constructed a system and a whole nation that appears dependent on him personally to make all decisions. He strengthened Russia's role in world politics and made it a geopolitical power. Now, he did this in part with the oil and gas. He also did it, though, with just chutzpah. He just simply presented himself as equals to the presidents and the premiers and the chancellors, and he behaved like them, and so people began thinking, well, maybe he was kind of like them. He took a very fragile democracy that was there in the 1990s, and he converted it into this consolidated autocracy. And with his number one goal being bringing all the nations who had left back into the Soviet Republic, he began moving. In 2008, he invaded Georgia. In 2014, he illegally annexed Crimea in the largest land grab in Europe since World War II. And in 2022, he invaded Ukraine with the absolute intention of annexing it as well. Irina Borogan, in her foreignpolicy.com column, wrote a piece called Russia's Youngest Generation Has Been Deprived. This is chilling to me. Look at this. She wrote, the most significant change Putin has made in Russia is that young Russians who grew up under Putin don't know what free discussion is or what democracy means. A society where one can make money only by not interfering in politics and not criticizing the authorities forces people to give up all options beyond their personal life and work. There's enormous anxiety in Russian society, which is only growing as coronavirus and economic crises worsen. That's chilling. In 2007, Putin was named Time Magazine's Person of the Year. So, like Gorbachev, he got that. At the photo shoot, which was really conducted by a British photographer who told the story later. Putin explained that he loved the Beatles. That's what he identified with Britain, the Beatles. And he said that his very favorite Beatles song was Yesterday. He was nominated 2 years, 2014 and 2021, for the Nobel Peace Prize, but he didn't win either one. But you know what? There have been some surprises with Putin. It turns out, other than preferring small horses, he actually loves animals. He's a true advocate for animals. So one of the things that he's done within Russia is pushed for laws that would secure better treatment for animals, whether they were working farm animals or they were pets. He also has signed into law some very important liberal economic reforms. He initiated the flat income tax at 13%. He reduced profit tax. He established new land and civil codes. And these and others reduced Russia's poverty by more than half and grew the GDP under his term. Russia had an uncomfortable war going on with Chechnya, and it morphed overnight because of one tragedy that had implications worldwide: the 9/11 attacks on America. Putin immediately recast his Chechnya problem as part of the West's struggle with Islamic fundamental terrorism. Lavrov tells us, quote, on September 11th, 2001, Russia's then President Vladimir Putin called U.S. President George W. Bush, making Putin the first international leader to speak with Bush after those attacks. The world's media became distracted, of course, by the 9/11 attacks. And so Putin began making many other moves. I'm going to read you something from Geisson's book. This is after 9/11, as people are reacting. Journalists are now using Moscow as a base from which to get to Afghanistan and some of the other places as the war on terror evolves. And she writes, there was not a whole lot to report along this particular storyline of what's happening in Russia. And nobody seemed to be concerned with it. Everybody was concerned elsewhere. The reporters glossed over the nationalization of the media. It was during this time that Putin finally put all media under his control. Portrayed the appointment of federal envoys to supervise elected governors as making order out of chaos. Completely ignored rollbacks in judicial reform, and increasingly chose to focus on economic topics. Unlike Yeltsin, who seemed always to take 2 steps forward and 1 step back on economic reform in a perennial effort to pacify the opposition, Putin filled both his staff's and the cabinet's economic arm with avowed liberals. His premier was the former finance minister, steeped in the Soviet bureaucratic tradition, but one sincerely committed to building on the reforms actually instituted in the 1990s, and conveniently for Putin, focused on this task to the exclusion of any other government business. Even before becoming acting president, while he was still merely the anointed successor, Putin had formed a think tank charged with creating a plan for economic development of Russia, and appointed a liberal economist who had once worked for his Leningrad mayor to run it. After the election, the head of the think tank would become Minister for Economic Development, a post Putin created just for him. So while the world begins looking at terrorism as the Islamic fundamentalist problem and begins reacting to it, Putin is increasing his grasp, his control of everything, and the world doesn't pay any attention. He gets away with much, And nobody pays attention because, after all, he has joined the West in fighting the Islamic terrorists. He's doing it in Chechnya. This is the surprise, I think. This monument is entitled "To the Struggle Against World Terrorism." It's a 10-story structure given to the United States by the Russian government. It's called the Tear of Grief, and it's a memorial to the victims of the September 11th, 2001 attacks. Another surprise was that Putin, now with control and with a plan that he's executing, he has a car custom built just for him. His predecessors had all had just sort of run-of-the-mill Rolls Royces and so forth. Not Putin. Remember, Putin wants to be perceived as a world-class leader on par with presidents, chancellors, and so forth. So he has a presidential limousine made. It's custom built for him in 2018. It's specially designed for him. It has an armored body, bulletproof windows, reinforced tires, an automatic fire extinguishing system, secure line communication systems, everything that you've heard about our president's the beast. It's the same kind of car. Nobody knows exactly how much it cost, but most think it was more than $250,000 US, which may seem low to you, but remember, he controls production. So I'm sure he got a cut rate for many of those things. A surprise for me, because of my background in literature, was when Putin decided to honor Alexander Solzhenitsyn. He was a Soviet-era dissident. Stalin, he wrote a joke about Stalin in a letter, so of course he was sent to the Gulag, and he spent 8 years there and then many, many more years in exile, many of them in the United States. In 1970, he won the Nobel Prize in Literature for his best-known work, One Day in the Life. It was an expose of what it was like to be in the Gulag under Stalin's regime and the terrible conditions. June of 2007, Putin gave him a state award for his humanitarian efforts. A completely surprising turn. Ivo Daalder wrote, "Under Vladimir Putin, Russia has embarked on a systematic challenge to the West." I want you to pay attention to this. This is the game plan spelled out by a journalist, an investigative reporter. Again, under Vladimir Putin, Russia has embarked on a systematic challenge to the West. The goal is to weaken the bonds between Europe and the United States and among the EU membership, to undermine NATO's solidarity, and to strengthen Russia's strategic position in its immediate neighborhood and beyond. That's code for annexing back in all of those republics that went away. So who is Vladimir Putin? I tell you at the beginning, he's an enigma. He's a mystery. But because of brave people like Georgiann and some investigative reporters who dared to print, I think we're getting a better picture of him. I look now at the Ukrainian invasion and look at that last statement about the systematic challenge to the West. And I look how some of it has not worked in Putin's favor. NATO is about to get 2 new members. So rather than undermining NATO's solidarity, suddenly NATO appears to be very strong and growing, not what he had planned. The bonds between Europe and the US seem strong. The UE members, Economic Union members, some have left, Britain left, but they seem to be holding their own as well. The strengthening Russia's strategic position in its immediate neighborhood depends entirely on whether or not he can also get Ukraine, and time will tell. I hope you've enjoyed this. I hope it made you think, and I hope it disturbed you a little bit, because I had those reactions when I was doing this research. I don't like Vladimir Putin. He frightens me. He's the kind of world leader that I think may not be stopped until he's truly stopped. He threatens us all, free people everywhere. And perhaps even more than that, he threatens his own people. Thank you.